On the night of 14 to April 15, 1912, one of the most terrible disasters of the 20th century occurred. The luxurious liner Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. There were more than 2,000 passengers on board, of whom only slightly more than 700 survived. The last of those who managed to escape passed away relatively recently. In 2009, we at ADME decided to find out what happened to some of the passengers who were lucky enough to survive the disaster. 1. Michel and Edmond Navratil. The brothers Michel and Edmond Navratil were traveling on the ship with their father, a French resident of Serbian origin. The boys' parents were divorced, but the wife allowed her ex-husband to take their sons on Easter holiday. Their father secretly took Michel and Edmond on the Titanic. He wanted to flee to America with his sons. Their mother had to search for her children for a whole month after the disaster, as they were registered on the ship under the fictitious names of Louis and Lola. When the ship began to sink, their father managed to put the boys in a lifeboat, but he himself perished. After their rescue, the media began to write about the brothers, as no one knew where their parents or guardians were. Michel and Edmond were temporarily taken in by another surviving passenger while the authorities searched for their relatives. The problem was that the children did not speak English and answered every question from the French consul with only oui, meaning yes. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, their mother was distraught, unable to understand where her children had gone. But one day she happened to see their photo in a newspaper and immediately went to New York to pick up her sons. Michel lived a long life. He went to college and soon married a classmate, and later earned a doctorate and became a professor of philosophy. Michel passed away at the age of 92. Edmond was an interior designer and later became an architect. During World War II, he was taken prisoner, where his health deteriorated significantly. Edmond died at the age of 43. Another story from the lives of people who were victims of the Titanic disaster. One of the greatest tragedies of the early 20th century was the sinking of the Titanic, the most powerful liner at the time. There were almost 3,500 people on board, including the crew. The lifeboats were designed to carry almost a third of those on the ship. If the boats had been filled to capacity during the accident, many more passengers could have been saved. But despite the harsh conditions of the Atlantic Ocean, some people still managed to survive. The Titanic set sail on its first and only voyage on April 10, 1912. There were 1,317 passengers and 908 crew members on board. The ship was scheduled to arrive in New York on April 17th. However, on the night of the 15th, the ship struck an iceberg, suffered several huge holes, and began to sink. Women and children were put into the lifeboats first, as well as people from the first class. Unfortunately, many people died precisely because people were divided into classes, even in such a terrible tragedy. In this wreck, the Titanic took the lives of nearly 1,500 people underwater with it. Only 712 people managed to escape. Those who managed to survive are considered lucky. Among the lucky ones were Armenians. An Armenian who survived the wreck of the Titanic was also saved from the genocide. The Titanic's demise was due to an explosion on board. One of the surviving passengers of the ship, writer, publicist Vaganak Bayirat, son of the famous Western Armenian writer Sambat Bayirat, Kyrgyzarians, was always sure of this. Vaganak was destined to be born twice. The biggest catastrophe of the XX century, the sinking of the ship Titanic, took the lives of about 1,500 people, among whom were Armenians. According to various reports, 7 to 12 Armenians bought a ticket for the ill-fated flight. Some of them fled Western Armenia to escape the oppression of the Turks. Only 3 or 4 Armenians managed to survive, including the writer and publicist Vaganak Bayirat. Fateful ticket to Boston. Vaganak Bayirat, one of the brightest representatives of the Armenian intelligentsia of Constantinople, was engaged in book publishing, together with his father Sambat by the age of 26. This was the purpose of his business trip to America, where he was to take a large batch of books. The consular department refused him a trip due to his health, suggesting that he should finally get on his feet and come back in a few months. Still, thanks to his father's connections, Vaganak received permission A senior researcher at the Charents Museum of Literature and Art told Sputnik Armenia. Vaganak traveled to Manchester and from there to Southampton, where he bought a ticket for the Titanic. The 12-square-meter cabin where Vaganak was put was well furnished, with bunk beds. His neighbors were two English gentlemen and a Frenchman named Morin. Vaganak's age. The young Armenian became friends with Morin, for had been fluent in French since childhood. On the night of 14 to 15 April 1912, Vaganak heard something like an explosion. The lights went out in the cabin. The Englishman, lying on the upper tiers of the bed, fell to the floor. One injured his head, the other his arm. Vaganak asked the Frenchman, "Morin, what is the matter?" To which the latter replied, "Trouble. We seem to be in danger." The young men assisted the Englishman, quickly dressed, and ran out of the cabin onto the deck. Chaos reigned on deck. People ran from side to side in panic. Sailors were preparing lifeboats, periodically shouting, "Women and children only." The friends then decided to jump into the bottomless ocean, hoping for a miracle. Luckily, both of them could swim. Vaganak took only his passport and money. He made a pouch and tied it around his neck. Morin got two lifebuoys. His friends found a more comfortable spot and jumped into the water. Vaganaka was periodically covered by waves, but he found the strength to break free from the depths of the ocean. He felt his arms and legs going numb and was about to lose consciousness when he suddenly saw a boat nearby. Vaganak grabbed the side of the boat, barely managing to say in broken English, "Save me, in the name of Christ." However, instead of help, he received a strong blow with an oar. He woke up in hospital. Vaganak did not remember how he was saved, but the situation was clarified by a woman who visited him in hospital, where he spent more than a month. On the 12th day, lying in his ward, Vaganak heard a voice calling him, "Oh, my dear boy." A crying woman hugged him. It turned out that she was his savior. In order to save Vaganak, the woman resorted to deception. She made a fuss in the boat, insisting that the young man be saved, as he was her son and her husband had remained on the ship and perished. On June 17, 1912, Vaganak arrived in Constantinople. The survivor of the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was destined to be saved during the first in history humanity genocide, the mass slaughter of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. On April 24, 1915, 600 representatives of the Armenian intelligentsia, including Smbat Bayrat, were arrested and later killed. Vaganak Bayrat once again managed to escape certain death. Second Armenian, as a result of political and religious unrest. David Vardanian and several of his compatriots, Enshan Gregorian, Arsen Siriganian, Herudian Zakarian, and Mamper Zakarian, fled the country and emigrated to Canada in order to join his compatriots in Brantford, who worked at a local foundry. His wife Miriam remained in their native village. Vardanian boarded the transatlantic liner Titanic in the French commune of Cherbourg as a third-class passenger. Ticket number 2658, price £7. For shillings, 6 pence. On the night of 14 to 15 April 1912, the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. On that same day, April 15th, Vardanian turned 22. He had learned to swim in a river near his native village, which enabled him to survive. Vardanian was rescued in a collapsible lifeboat, the Engelhart. According to other sources, he was evacuated in one of the regular lifeboats, the 13th, or more likely, the 15th, in Canada, together with his compatriot Enshan Gregorian, who also survived the crash. He went to Palmart, Hamilton, and lived there for several years before finally settling in the United States. He thought his wife had stayed in Turkey and fallen victim to the Armenian genocide during the massacres in Kiev, but nevertheless continued to write home in the hope of finding her. After years of searching, he finally found out that his wife was alive. The couple reunited after an 11-year separation. Their first meeting took place on the Rainbow Bridge in Niagara Falls. His wife was on the Canadian side, and he was on the American side. Vardanian and his wife settled in Crawford, Middletown, Pennsylvania. The couple had 3 children: Jack, 1924 to 1986; Rosa, 1926 to 2012, later the wife of Gevorg Vardanian; and Alice, born in 1931, later the wife of Dan Voitylac. According to the 1940 census, they were still living in Midville, but later moved to Detroit, Michigan. David Vardanian died in Detroit on August 3, 1966 at the age of 76 and is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. Enshan Gregorian was 20 years old when his father urged him to emigrate from Western Armenia and start a new life, as thousands of Armenians did, trying to escape Turkish violence. Enshan travels to Europe and purchases a third-class ticket on the Titanic. His father urged him to leave Ottoman Turkey and start a new life in Canada. In order to bring their younger brothers later, says Enshan Gregorian's grandson Van Solomonian. Continuing, my grandfather and 4 other Armenians went to Cherbourg, France, where, as fate would have it, they bought tickets for the Titanic. Enshan was one of 700 third-class passengers. According to Solomonian, his grandfather said that on April 14th, when the ship collided with an iceberg, he was playing cards with his friends. After the collision, panic ensued. The situation was complicated by the fact that third-class passengers were on the lower decks, and the doors were locked because orders had been given to rescue first and second class passengers first. They barely managed to get out and climb onto the deck. My grandfather got into lifeboat number 10 and was saved, says Solomonian. Most of the third class passengers did not survive. More than 2/3 of the passengers died because they were unable to get out onto the deck. The total number of passengers was about 2,200, and only 700 survived after his rescue. Enshan Gregorian went to Canada, where he settled permanently in the city of St. Catherine, working at the General Motors factory and earning enough money. He fulfilled his father's dream and brought his younger brothers to Canada, where he also founded the first Armenian church in the city. Enshan died in 1985 at the age of 89. Wang Solomonian, who now lives in Toronto, describes his grandfather as a quiet man who spoke little English and always fiddled with traditional Armenian prayer beads. Enshan rarely spoke about the fateful events that took place on the Titanic, but he never forgot the horror of that day. After that, he never set foot on a ship again and never went into the lake. He couldn't overcome that fear.